Well, welcome one and all to this truly unique, beautiful monthly reading series via the vision of the poets at Headmistress Press, Mary Miriam, Risa Dennenberg, and Rita Mae Reese. Today's program features Julie Marie Ward and channeling the fabulous Audre Lorde, who I like to remind everybody was in the very first series released in 2015, I believe. A reminder that this is the Lesbian Trading Card reading series, and you can purchase the trading cards with the exception of that first series from Headmistress Press's website, along with the incredible books by Headmistress Press poets. Well, let me not wait another moment longer, because I've been waiting for this reading for months, ever since I saw the schedule of readings. It is my incredible joy, elation. If I am doing everything I can to not jump through the screen with like my absolute, to introduce today's featured writer, poet, essayist, human being extraordinaire, Julie Marie Ward. And I told Julie I was going to do this, but I love the poetry. I've recently, I think last week, heard her read from a new collection, but I also would like to hearken back to a book of essays written in collaboration with Denise Duhamel, The Unrhymables. And it is, if you have not read these essays, they include, I think, everything that you would want to hear about the life of being a woman in the 21st century, and being also it's a coming out story as well, in many facets. It's so, the word I'm going to use is, it is such a prismatic collection, and I really encourage you to purchase that collection. It is not a Headmistress Press title, but maybe Julie will tell us a little more about the Unrhymables collaborations in prose and let us know the press. Well, let me now share the card, the bio of the wonderful card from Julie Marie Ward. And of course, now in my little screen world, where has it gone? There's Audre Lorde. Okay, give me a moment, folks, and I will pull that up. My apologies. I had it, and it's elusive. But just like that first series. Recent. Okay. So sorry. Well, I will go on and on while I am talking, while I am pulling up that card, and let you know that, again, you can be purchasing the titles of Headmistress Press. They make for fantastic pairings with the trading cards, and great gifts for any reason whatsoever. Well, here we go. Again, let me This is the epitome of live readings. Julie Marie Wade, you can read on the back of Julie Marie Wade's card, was born in Seattle in 1979 and has called herself a poet since childhood, but planned to become a private detective. What a great detail. She wanted to stay in college forever, leading to bachelor's degrees in psychology and creative writing, a master's in English, an MFA in poetry, and a PhD in interdisciplinary humanities. Wade's poetry collections include Postage Due, poems and prose poems from White Pine Press, 2013, which was winner of the Marie Alexander Poetry Series. When I Was Straight, from A Midsummer's Night Press, 2014, was selected for the American Library Association's Over the Rainbow list. And Six from Red Hen Press, 2016, was winner of the Arojo to the Lighthouse Poetry Prize, selected by C.D. Wright.
Wow.
And that's right. Wow. Right? Wow.
Wow.
Wow. It's right there on the back of the card, which you can have. And here we go. Finally, Same Sexy Marriage, a novella in poems from A Midsummer Night's Press, 2018. Denise DeHamel and Maureen Seaton wrote that Wade's, quote, lush post-confessional poems are unabashed in their desire, tentative, then bold in their knowledge. Wade teaches creative writing at Florida International University and lives with her spouse, Angie Griffin, and their two cats on Hollywood Beach. And thanks for your patience. And would you please give the heartiest spring welcome to Julie Marie Wade.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Folks I know, folks I don't know, I'm just so honored to be part of the series. First of all, the actual lesbian poet trading card series, but also the reading series. I think it was about 6 months ago now that Mary had sent out an email and asked some of the contemporary poets if we wanted to write back and choose a historical poet under whose influence we've written in our lives. And I thought, I'm never going to get Audre Lorde, but I'm just going to chance it. I'm just going to see, because it was like a first come, first serve, like whoever responded first. And so I requested her, not thinking that I would get her, but the timing was right. And so so thankfully now I've been looking forward to this for 6 months or so, and knowing that I would get to spend time with you and also with Audre Lorde. And this book, which I highly recommend, it's very hard to choose among the 9 published poetry collections of Audre Lorde, but the collected poems, that's the place I would go. And they've taken great care to put all of them in their original form. So if you don't have this book, I highly recommend it. Then you'll never be looking for the poem you need. They'll all be in the same place. So what I thought I would do today is, I was daunted only recently. I've been feeling really joyful about this and rereading the book. And, you know, it's hard to choose which poems to share because there are so many and they're all worth sharing. But very recently, I had a moment of thinking, I don't know how I can do this. How could I possibly do justice to Audre Lorde? And then I realized, like, it was almost like a voice in my head said, oh, but she already did justice. You don't have to do that. She already did it. And she's the poet of justice to me, for me. She's, you know, the kind of poet who brings art and activism together, and I don't have to do justice. She's already done it. So I get to just celebrate her work and her legacy and share a little bit about her influence on me as well. And I thought the best way for me to introduce her to you, because I'm sure most of you have a relationship with her and her work in some way, is to just tell you a little bit about how that happened for me. And it's really strange because I went to school for a long time. As Sandy said, I loved being a student. But strangely, there's a gap in my education where I studied the prose of Audre Lorde. Her prose books were part of my comps. They were taught in my classes. But there's this hole in my education where I never got to take a class in her poetry. It was never taught to me. And so in a way, today is a corrective for that. It's a really beautiful corrective for that omission. And I kept thinking, like, how can this be? And about 15 years ago, I bought the collected poems because I thought I have to rectify this on my own. And that's the gift of education. Not that your educators can give you everything, but that they can help you find what you're missing and give you resources to always find what you need. And so I realized I need to be reading this person. So I began reading her poetry on my own. I always had the book nearby, and I was always reading the poems kind of a la carte, always. Just, an Audre Lorde poem, and then here and there, and kind of as a ritual, but not in order, not in any kind of systematic way. And in 2015, actually pretty close to this time of year, I thought, I'm going to do a systematic read, and I'm going to do my own independent study. My students do independent studies on writers that they want to study. At FIU, where I teach, there is a phenomenal professor and poet and scholar, Donna Ware-Soley, and Dr. Ware-Soley teaches a whole class in just primary source work with Audre Lorde and Toni Morrison. And I'm thinking, I didn't have that class, and I'm so sorry that I didn't, but I'm so happy for my students who get to take that class. But I'm going to do my own independent study with this book, and I'm going to read it in order so that I can encounter the poems in the way that she brought them out into the world. So I started in February of 2015 because it was Black History Month. That seemed like a good time to start. I kept reading, right, because this is about 500 pages, all the way through systematically into March, which is Women's History Month. And I finished the book at the end of April, which is National Poetry Month. And I thought, I really feel like Lorde would bless this project because it's honoring her intersectional identities, and she's a poet who's uncompromising about those identities. She always identified herself publicly in her work as a Black lesbian mother warrior poet, and I love how irreducible she was in her presentation of self and in her work, and not having to choose among those identities. And so I wanted to read across those identity-bearing months and just spend time with every one of the poems in sequence. And I didn't know I'd get to talk about any of them with you in the future, like 6 years in the future. But that's how I kind of started studying Lorde more conscientiously on my own. When I think about anyone whose work I admire or who I look up to, I always think, if our dates overlap at all, like if we were ever alive at the same time, what were we doing at the same time? Like, I try to place us. And Audre Lorde was born in 1934. She died in 1992. I was born in 1979. And when I think about her life, one of the markers for me is that I was born in September. And so just a few weeks after my birth in Washington State, here's Audre Lorde, which I would have had no way of knowing this then. But here she is being a voice for LGBT liberation, the March on Washington in October 1979. And I love to think about that. I love to think about, like, tiny me on the other side of the country, like, not knowing how much I was going to need her and poets like her, and her addressing, the nation's capital in such a powerful way. And so I think about the ways that I needed Lorde before I knew her. I think about how a lot of my own childhood was very sheltered and was about hiding and certainly later staying in the closet, and how there was Lorde even from, when I was a couple weeks old, being the voice for outness and being present and being true, and our silence will not save us. And so a lot of my journey is trying to get there, has always been trying to get to where she was when I was born. And she passed away when I was in 8th grade. I read that Audre Lorde wrote her first poem when she was in 8th grade. And I think about how in 8th grade, someone gave me a typewriter, and I had started typing up some of my first poems from my notebook, and how much it would have meant if I had had any idea that a poet like Audre Lorde had existed when I was in 8th grade, or even really that any women or people of color or queer people existed at all in the canon, because that wasn't the world that I was seeing yet in school at all, but it was to come. So 5 years after her death, when I started college in 1997, here's sort of my Audre Lorde origin story. I went to meet my university assigned advisor, and I was going to a small liberal arts school, Pacific Lutheran University. It's in Tacoma, Washington, where my dad had gone to school. And my parents, ironically, very much wanted me to go to school because they thought it would be such a sheltering place. But it turned out to be the opposite of that. It turned out to be the opening place in a lot of ways. And so I went to meet my advisor, and her name was Dr. Beth Craig. She was a history professor and an honors college professor. And those things were very important. But most important for me at that moment was that she was the first out lesbian I had ever met in my life. And I was 18. And she spoke really honestly about her life. She had a partner, Suzanne, who was a librarian, which is symbolic because Audre Lorde was a librarian and because I later married a librarian. It's all connected. But I was in awe of this professor. I was in awe of her partnership. I was in awe of her partner being a librarian. Just the whole thing seemed so magical. And I would go to Beth's office, and also she told us to call her Beth, which was just an unthinkable privilege. So I would sit in that office, and there was this giant poster behind her desk. And I never asked her because I think I was kind of starstruck of Beth, and then I was doubly starstruck of this person who I didn't yet recognize, who was like looming beautifully behind her. And this majestic presence was in fact Audre Lorde. And I knew this person had to be really important to Beth. And the quote that was printed boldly underneath the figure was, "So it is better to speak remembering we were never meant to survive." And every time I went to that office for 4 years, those were the words that I read over Beth's shoulders. And I kept thinking about them and thinking about them. And like, what did that mean? And what did that mean to me? What did that mean in context of my life? And then a couple years after that, I think it was when I was in grad school, I was reading a poetry anthology. And it's the way that sometimes in retrospect, you see the foreshadowing. I'm reading a poem called A Litany for Survival, which many of you will know. And I'm thinking that I'm encountering this poet for the first time. I get to the final stanza of the poem, and the final stanza is those 3 lines. It is those words. And it was the message in the bottle finally arrived, probably when I was 21 or 22. And I realized this is the person. This is almost the message that's been sent to me, was that I was supposed to be reading this person all along. And there she was looking over me and watching over Beth Craig's shoulder. So I couldn't not start with A Litany for Survival. I know this is a poem many of you will know, but it's also, you can't hear it too many times. For those of you who don't know it, or who I've been trying with a year on Zoom now to really practice more like orality in our classes, like not reading along with poems and just trying to listen more. So if you don't have the poem in front of you, that's actually an asset, I think. It is in 4 stanzas, but it's kind of 3 super stanzas, and then this final tercet that is the whole, it's the volta of the whole poem, and it's the words that were on that wall. So I'm going to start with A Litany for Survival by Audre Lorde. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward at once, before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hoped to silence us. For all of us this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. So that poem, right? That poem is such a necessary poem, and it's a touchstone poem for me, and not just for me. Obviously, it's a touchstone poem for so many people. And when I think about the collection, the collected works of Audre Lorde, and all the poems here, and like, what poems do you choose? What poems do you bring out? One of the ways I thought about doing this is the way that I sometimes talk about heart poems in my own classes. Like, I ask students to choose heart poems when we read a collection, like a poem that resonates deeply for them, but also to try to stitch together poems, like to find linkages, because if you're looking at a poet's book, but also if you're looking at 9 books of a poet's work, you're going to start to hear those echoes and recursions across their work. Like, what is this poet most invested in? What are these poets' themes? Is there an image that comes back in multiple poems? And we try to talk a lot about how that isn't like a bad thing. Like, you don't get to just use one word or one image once. It's about what can you do anew? Because your resident obsessions and questions and fears are always with you. And so when you're writing, if you're writing out of yourself, then it would be untrue to not touch back to those things, but to keep touching back in new ways and keep innovating with form. And I can't think of a poet who has innovated more with form than Audre Lorde. When you think about her tiny, like, lyric capsules and how potent they are, and you think about her poems that are pages long, when you think about her range of lyric and narrative, and her range of poems that are explicitly polemical, and her poems that are very, very tender and intimate, there's just an incredible range. But survival is also a theme that persists. And so I wanted to pair with A Litany for Survival a poem that I think might be slightly less well known. It's called Artisan, and it's another poem where survival comes back. And some of the images in this poem also sort of haunt me. Like, when I think of Lorde images, a number of them rest in this poem, as does the theme of survival. So poet reckoning with survival, but in a new way and in a new form. This is a poem in 3 stanzas, and the middle stanza is the small one here. It's kind of like a hinge at the center, and for me it's also kind of the heart passage of the poem. Artisan. In workshops without light, we have made birds that do not sing, kites that shine but cannot fly with the speed by which light falls in the throat of delicate working fire. I thought I had discovered a survival kit buried in the moon's heart, flat and resilient as turtles, a case of tortoiseshell hung in the mouth of darkness, precise, unlikely markings carved into the carapace, sweet meat beneath. I did not recognize the shape of my own name. Our bedspread is a midnight flower coming all the way down to the floor. There, your craft shows. And as an aside, the word carapace is a word I knew before, but it's actually because of this poem years ago that I wrote a lyric essay called Carapace. Just that, even that idea of the shell, but having a new way to talk about the shell. Like, sometimes all it takes is one word from Audre Lorde to open something for us. But thinking about survival, and then the heart passage for me of I did not recognize the shape of my own name. And that really made me want to speak to the role that names have played in Lorde's life and in her work. And so I was thinking about names so much. And when I reread that poem, I thought, we have to talk about names. So many of you know this, but in case you don't, Audre Lorde, when she was born in 1934, was named Audrey, Audrey, right? Audrey Geraldine Lorde. And there's this wonderful moment in her memoir, Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, which I think is maybe the first text that I read of her work that was, taught to me in a class. There's a fabulous moment here very early on. And here's what she writes in her memoir about her name. I used to love the evenness of Audre Lorde. So like the 5 letters of the first and the 5 of the last, and she has them all spelled out in capitals. I used to love the evenness of Audre Lorde at 4 years of age, but I remembered to put on the Y because it pleased my mother. And because, as she always insisted to me, that was the way it had to be, because that was the way it was. No deviation was allowed from the interpretations of correct. And so this moment, I mean, probably resonates with many of us, but a lot of Lord's work addresses tension with her mother and tensions around claiming herself, right? And like recognizing ourselves in our names might be one way. So on the adjoining page, I don't know if you all can see this, but you see how she's written her name without the Y, like descending stairs that have this perfect mirrored symmetry, and just choosing even at such a young age, and there were consequences, but choosing even at such a young age, I'm going to let that Y go. Part of it was the visual field. She struggled with her vision all her life, and so seeing the Y was actually hard. It was hard to keep that in her sightline, but the 5 letters stacked over the 5 letters was this perfect symmetry. She liked the look of it, she liked the sound of it, and she kept it. So I was struck even by that at the very early part of her life, she was renaming herself and choosing the shape of her own name. That's thrilling, first of all. Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, which is the memoir, and truly it's the coming of age, the Bildungsroman, right? So Zami is like a slang word for lesbian, but I love that she defines it specifically. Like she makes a stronger, more specific definition. It's a Karaku word, so part of her mother's heritage, and she says it means women working together as friends and lovers. So I love that she's like taking this name, she's adding more depth and complexity to what it means. And then I learned in reading about Lord later in life that right near the very end of her life, she died in the Virgin Islands. She had left her home, as it had been in New York, and she participated in an African naming ceremony where her name right before her death was changed to Gamba Adisa, and it means warrior, she who makes her meanings known. And it just really struck me that this is someone who kept evolving her whole life, kept reclaiming, kept reknowing, and also was willing to rename herself even at the end of her life. And so for me, that meant something like learning and growing are lifelong. They don't just stop at a certain age or with a certain number of books or awards, because she had all of those and she was still growing. So I thought, okay, maybe the name poem is something that maybe most of us in creative writing ask ourselves and our students to write, and I thought it might be a good place for me to read something written that I've written under the influence of Audre Lorde. I can tell you that this is one of my own name poems from my new book. When I was growing up in my house in Washington State, this is going to sound really odd, but it's true. From the time I was as young as I can remember, I think it was probably always there was a sign on my bedroom door that said Julie Marie Wade, attorney at law, that someone had made for my parents when I was born. I was the only child. And I had a very mixed relationship with coming home to a room that looked like an office, like you were going into a law office of Julie Marie Wade, the attorney. And my parents really wanted me to be a doctor, so this was kind of odd, but I think it was that the attorney or the doctor were like similar ideas of success. Notice not in the arts kind of success, but like there were similar ideas of like what it meant to be a professional, what it meant to be successful. And so I kind of liked it because I thought like, oh, having high hopes for me and my achievements from the time I'm like a tiny person. But then also I kind of didn't like it because I thought, you're already attaching so much to this name. Like, when do I get to do something with it that I want to do? And then the fateful conversation that I had with my mom, that's really at the underside of the poem I'm going to read to you, was that she said, well, that won't actually be your name because you'll have to change it when you get married. And so then I thought, oh no, I've got a lot of things to work out around this. So it's the inversion for me of thinking about how frustrated I was from, this is probably when I was early in my teenage years, being reminded that I wouldn't get to keep the name no matter what I wanted to attach to it. And it's kind of the opposite of Lorde and the re-empowering herself to keep changing her name. But then I was thinking, if I want to build something and attach it to Julie Marie Wade, you're telling me I have to change it. And so the idea that I could even question that, and that I was going to find poets who would give me ways to question that, or the idea that, I didn't have to marry, or even bigger, that I didn't have to necessarily marry a man, was really radical, even though I understand that I'm a lot younger generationally than Audre Lorde, but these messages still exist, and they very much existed in my home. So the poem I'm going to read from Skirted, which is the new poetry book. I'm going to read a name poem called Roanoke, and I realized that this was a poem I kind of had to write thinking about names and how we inhabit them or don't. Roanoke. I will consider changing my name, but not the last one, though. No, I have made my peace with that troubled past. A promised woman returned to the bridge of unhinged, water lilies and lady watching. No, I mean the first name, syllables the cuckold struggles to forget, pitching his tent, his tongue in unfamiliar soil. Bereft of vow and ring, I am no gold star. I am neither the intricate origami of a map unfolded on the dash, a clash between two opposing camps, my mother's stilted voice, my father's sad concern. Of course I never learn. A footprint in silt, a gash on the last good tree. Proof of life in the lost colony of broken limbs and flowers emboldened by sun. Goodbye was not part of that vernacular. There wasn't time. A deer hides behind the kilt of jagged roses, persistent even in autumn, even until the white-capped mountains realign. We contain our opposites. I kiss your goose flesh in the snow. My mother will not let go, even when the dream dissolves into scream, and the mirrors must be covered to avoid alarm. City of other faces, ancestors foraging for their uncertain lives, beckoning back to a simpler time, when disappearance was common as internal rhyme. As Virginia, which you can call me if you dare. So I'm going to switch from that poem, which I think Skirted is kind of a hard book, but a necessary book for me. It was kind of a book about family estrangement and what it means to come to terms with the fact that sometimes your family of origin cannot come to terms with you. And so a lot of these poems are reckoning, and I think a lot of the poems, it took me a really long time to write this book, and I think reading all of Lorde in between helped me finish it. I really believe that. And the permissions, she's an extraordinary permission giver as a poet. So that's what my students and I are also looking for when we read. What are the invitations this writer gives you? What did you formerly think was out of bounds that you couldn't say, that they're helping you say? I want to read one of my favorite Audre Lorde poems. I know that there are a lot of them, so I'm only highlighting a few here, but the poem Change of Season, which is from fairly early in her body of work. And one of the reasons I love this poem so much is because the opening couplet of the poem, the opening unrhymed couplet, is just a question that I think could be a lyric thesis for her whole body of work, but also for many of us. It's such a good, perfect capsule question for trying to figure out who you are. And the question is, am I to be cursed forever with becoming somebody else on the way to myself? I want to epigraph that at the start of everything that I set out to write. And then what follows is kind of a self-historicization, which I also really love, is how much narrative content she can also pack into a relatively small space. So this is only a 4-stanza poem, and the bulk of it is happening in 3 stanzas, but with that lyric question as a guide at the top. So I'm going to read this poem, Change of Season, and maybe you've not heard it before, which would be even better. Change of Season. Am I to be cursed forever with becoming somebody else on the way to myself? Walking backward, I fall into summers behind me, salt with wanting, lovers or friends, a job, wider shoes, a cool drink, freshness, something to bite into, a place to hide out of the rain, out of the shifting melange of seasons, where the cruel boys I chased and their skinny dodgeball sisters flamed and died in becoming the brown autumn, left in search of who tore the streamers down at graduation, Christmas, my wedding day, and as winter wore out, the babies came, angry effort and reward in their appointed seasons. My babies tore out of me like poems, after I slept and woke to the thought that promise had come again, this time more sure than the dream of being sweet 16 and somebody else, walking 5 miles through the August city with a free dog, thinking, now we will be the all-American family. We had just gotten a telephone, and the next day my sister cut his leash on Broadway. That dog of my childhood bays at the new moon. As I reach into time up to my elbows, extracting the taste and sharp smell of my first lover's neck, rough as the skin of a brown pear ripening, I was terribly sure I would come forever to April with my first love, who died on a Sunday morning, poisoned and wondering, would summer ever come? As I face an ocean of seasons, they start to separate into distinct and particular faces, listening to the cover beginning to crack open, and whether or not the fruit is worth waiting. Thistles and arrows and apples are blooming. The individual beautiful faces are smiling and moving. Even the pavement begins to flow into new concretions. The 8th day is coming. I have paid dearly in time for love I hoarded unseen. Summer goes into my words and comes out reason. So I don't think I have to even explain why I love that poem. I think you all know, and I think you all can feel the reasons to love that poem. But a couple of heartlines for me are, as I reach into time up to my elbows, just taking something like time, which is so hard to visualize, and making it like a sleeve, like making it something that we can see. That gift that she has for making the abstract not only concrete, but like a luminous particular. And also thistles and arrows and apples are blooming. That triple, the power of those 3 concretes, and that thistles and arrows and apples are such different kinds of blooms, but that all could be equated with blooming. So I really cherish that poem and its lyric question, which guides also my interest in writing, lyric essays. Like that question is kind of a guidepost, I think, for a lot of us in a lot of genres. The poem that appears right after it in the book, and this is how it was also originally published, is called Generation 2, and this poem is 1 stanza. I make notes on how long it takes to read poems. It's only a 16-second poem, but it is like a perfect distillation. It's like a capsule, and in some ways, it feels to me like you read the first poem and you experience it as a painting that has a lot of complexity, like a tapestry that's been framed, let's say. And then this Generation 2 that follows is like a detail of the painting enlarged, focusing on the mother specifically and that relationship. And this poem, Generation 2, a black girl going into the woman her mother desired and prayed for, walks alone and afraid of both their angers. That kind of compression for me, like that is the perfect example of a lyric poem that you can take all of the history and compress something so small and yet so large, that perfect juxtaposition. And in the thinking about parents and family, I wanted to read a poem that I think is one of my poems that maybe is most influenced by the style of Lorde in her longer poems, more like the Change of Seasons poem I read. So I'll read this poem and then we'll switch back to Lorde, and I'll show you some more examples of her work that I also am still learning from. The poem I want to read you from Skirted is called Fallout. And I think back to the idea of Lorde as a permission giver, something I love about Lorde are her extended conceits, how she will build a poem, a long poem, around an extended metaphor, and keep coming back to that metaphor and keep mining that metaphor for its language. And so in my poem Fallout, I'm using an epigraph that's a scientific epigraph, and Lorde has a number of poems that are also science-based that I'm emulating too, even though you haven't heard them today. So that the epigraph is: radioactive decay is the set of various processes by which unstable atomic nuclei emit subatomic particles. Decay is said to occur in the parent nucleus and to produce a daughter nucleus. And that's the sort of like when science gives you the metaphor, I always think like, what would Audre Lorde do? And I feel certain she would make a poem of that. So I tried also to do a poem, Fallout. Allegory made easy, our story foreshadowed by science. Another nuclear family destined for disintegration. But we want to be special, don't we? We want to believe in the mercurial majesty of our own destruction. Even now, all these miles away, I take refuge in cool, subjunctive caves. If only I believed more avidly in God. If only I had kept the fourth commandment. My mother had a plan. She told me to stay at home till I was 30, live in her basement, borrow her car. I could take the bus to school in the university district, complete my PhD without the desperate quest for money, without downing a single pint of debt. My father agreed it only made sense. And then, by their unanimous decree, I would be married, and a down payment would be waiting for me on a 3-bedroom brick rambler in their Waterview community, close by, so they could always watch my children. That birthright was wealth and security, secret sex and cigarettes stubbed out beneath the wide camellia tree that obscured my bedroom window all those years. It was my mother screaming for reasons unbeknownst to science, my father pledging his fleeting remedy. Whatever you want, darling, whatever you need. So we come back again to detritus, the cells of appeasement and displeasure sloughing off my skin, until I glimpsed the mannequin of their most ample aspirations, that proxy woman I could not become. My father said, "You're killing your mother." My mother said, "Listen to your father." But I had a sundial and a strong intuition and that sinking ship feeling that shook me clean to my soles. We were headed for a capsize, my family and I, evoking words like asunder and adrift. "Are you trying to be an outcast?" my mother asked, which only begged the question, cast out of what? A house of order, built on stilts, perched in sand. Secret society of private misgivings and public thanksgivings. There's what we say and what we do, and then there's what we breathe, whole climate committed to asphyxiation, slow incineration of a last honest wish, final non-bureaucrat's desire. I can hold my breath a long time underwater, my swimmer's lungs primed for intervals of deep submersion. But I can't open my eyes. It's a problem of underworld survival, learning the way of touch, calculated kinesthesia through a wilderness of stray sounds, refracted lights. Here beneath the surface of things, where the floating debris cannot reach me, I still feel the earthly tremors, voices booming, searchlights probing these depths. And the poem I actually want to follow, you heard survival, that's my nod to Lorde, but there's a lot of other implicit nods to Lorde there. But I want to read the poem by Lorde after this poem where she uses swimming as a metaphor. And as I was reading the poem in preparation for this talk, I realized, oh, there's that poem from Audre Lorde. This will make the thematic link of my presentation stronger. But also, I really want you all to hear this poem, A Question of Climate. If you don't know this poem, it's also a lyric capsule poem. It's also a single stanza. And it's a poem for me about the other big theme in Lorde's work that's connected to survival, but the idea of honesty. And how hard it can be to be honest, especially if what we have to say is not what someone wants to hear, including someone we love. And so A Question of Climate, the opening line is, I learned to be honest. And that was a poem, of course, as I was reading. I'm still learning how to be honest because of the fear of hurting people when you are honest and hurting yourself when you're not. And how do you navigate that? And for me, this is a poem from Lorde that works as a primer. And it uses swimming too. So that was a touchstone as well. A Question of Climate. I learned to be honest the way I learned to swim, dropped into the inevitable. My father's thumbs in my hairless armpits about to give way. I am trying to surface carefully, remembering the water's shadow-legged musk, cannons of salt exploding, my nostrils rage, and for years, my powerful breaststroke was a declaration of war. I love the final lines too so much, that the warrior poet is declaring war, but declaring war on inauthenticity, on refusal not to speak the truth. There's something in this poem that epitomizes some of the best of what Lorde does, and also in a single stanza that just takes my breath away. And I wanted to pair it with another small but large Lorde poem that comes from near the end of her collected works, called Out of the Wind, which is also one of those compressed single stanza, incredibly potent poems. And this one, I hear in it, I sometimes ask my students to find partner poems within a collection, like two poems that feel like they speak to each other. And A Question of Climate for me, that declaration of war was the voice of, I will be honest no matter what. But at the same time, this Out of the Wind poem is the warrior poet in some sense also addressing peace, like how do we make peace and also navigate being warriors at the same time. And so there's something about this poem that's a softer valence, and you'll hear the anaphora, right? The repetition of a word or phrase. She's using 4-5 times in just one stanza, which is incredible compression. So you'll hear it. I'll read it first. We can talk about it. Out of the Wind. For the days when the coffee grounds refuse to settle and the last toothpick rolls into a crack on the floor and all the telephone messages are from enemies or for other people only, and the good old days lie between pages of books we have already written. For the acorn of fear in each April, will this be the year Earth refuses to forgive us with a blush of green? For the weary assumptions of next winter's chill, and for silent days in between, your face mingled in tulips after brief rain. So just on the level of images for all of my fellow poets and appreciators of poetry, the last toothpick rolling into a crack on the floor, like that level of zoomed in, that level of palpable attention is just astonishing to me. The enjambment of the single line where lie gets its own line. So the good old days, you round the bend of the line, lie. Just love that there's a visual play on words and then between pages of books. But for a moment, we have to think about what lies are embedded in the good old days. And then that acorn of fear in April, there's this way that these poems are also doing that biomythographic work that she talks about in her memoir of echoing back to the lover who had passed in April. And while these poems, of course, have a speaker, I think Lorde is pretty clear that the speaker is modeled on herself. So we're hearing echoes of tragedies and triumphs across poems. There's something about April that's a site of fear because of the past grief connected with it. And then that beautiful, hopeful image that still comes with this spring, your face mingled in tulips after brief rain. That's just, it's a perfect image for me. I want to read only one more poem from my book, and then I want to finish with a longer poem by Lorde. The poem that I want to read to you is a short poem that was pretty directly inspired by some of these later poems of Lorde's, where I feel like I'm making peace with the past happening in those later poems. And I needed to figure out how to do that to also finish my book of like, what do you do when you can't suture some of the wounds, but you find a way to do that, hopefully with language and with poem making. So I'm going to read a poem called Détente, which means like a truce, like maybe at the end of a war, right? I was thinking about being a warrior, what does that mean? But also, what does it mean to be a peacemaker, even if you have to make the peace by yourself? And so this poem is written under the influence of Lorde. Détente. I think of you now, knowing we are as we must be, knowing you are not one woman or one man, but a collage of bodies, passed over, slipped under, seen through. And I want you to think of me in this collective way also, to blush on a bridge in cold weather, imagining my hand, and again under awnings in the cinematic rain, conjuring my purple umbrella. Once, which is a sapling bent early in storm, thereafter, which is long and unremitting, making old our new. Mornings I plead, I'm sorry, to the wind, to the dogs in heat, to the harvest of my own good life, my plebeian heart. And because it's really hard to end any kind of tribute to Audre Lorde, because I just want to say to everyone, you've got to read all the poems, and then you've got to talk to everyone you know about all the poems. So I spent a lot of time thinking about, if I kind of thread the needle through and I take you through some of her poems and some of my poems written under their influence, where do we end up? And the poem where I thought we should end up is Stations, which some of you, I know, even if you don't recognize the name, will recognize the poem. It's so beautifully rendered, of course, but I also think a lot about poets who are powerful in their diction and powerful in their image making, but also really deliberate in their structure. And that's what I always come back to with Lorde, is that there's a very clear, this poem has one of the clearest structures. So it's a really beautiful poem if you mentor any poets in your life, a beautiful poem to model and to have students do close emulation work with. Like if you think of emulation as a kind of scaffolding where you start with someone else's text and you gradually build into it. And then eventually you can take that scaffold away and what remains is your work and your voice. But this is a beautifully laid out poem in 6 stanzas. And it's "some women" is the anaphoric refrain that starts each of the stanzas, and the big volta or the big turn comes in the 6th and final stanza. And you'll of course hear it, and it's a big turn, but sort of laying out, like not speaking for all women, but some women this experience and some women this experience, and kind of giving that collective power and building it until the end with the turn. So I offer this for Audre Lorde. Thank you so much for listening, and also for your enthusiasm for this poet. Here is Stations. Some women love to wait for life, for a ring in the June light, for a touch of the sun to heal them, for another woman's voice to make them whole, to untie their hands, put words in their mouths, form to their passages, sound to their screams, for some other sleeper to remember their future, their past. Some women want for their right train in the wrong station, in the alleys of morning for the noon to holler, the night to come down. Some women wait for love to rise up, the child of their promise, to gather from earth what they do not plant, to claim pain for labor, to become the tip of an arrow, to aim at the heart of now, but it never stays. Some women wait for visions that do not return, where they were not welcome, naked, for invitations to places they always wanted to visit, to be repeated. Some women wait for themselves around the next corner and call the empty spot peace. But the opposite of living is only not living, and the stars do not care. Some women wait for something to change, and nothing does change, so they change themselves. Thank you. Thank you, Audre Lorde. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Gosh. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. You know, folks, let's just take a moment to unmute and thank Julie and Audra for that beautiful braiding of your lives and work. And then I'm going to read Audra's card and just say a few more things before we go to the open mic. So yes, thank you. That was just
Excellent.
yeah,
Fabulous.
thank you so much.
Fabulous.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm going to share Audra's card from the first series. And here's a picture of a great postcard of her in what I like to call her Technicolor dream coat. So, Audre Lorde, lesbian activist, poet, was born, as Julie said, in 1934 in New York City to West Indian immigrant parents. She published her first poetry collection, The First Cities, in 1968, the same year she met her lifelong partner, Francis Clayton. Her 1973 collection, From a Land Where Other People Live, was nominated for a National Book Award. Her first prose collection, The Cancer Journals, won the 1981 Gay Caucus Book of the Year Award. Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, a work she labeled biomythography, came out in 1982. In 1988, she won a National Book Award for A Burst of Light. In the 1980s, Lorde co-founded Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press. She wrote about racial injustice, feminism, the parent-child relationship, as well as about cancer, which ended her life in 1992. Adrienne Rich wrote that Lorde writes as a Black woman, a mother, a daughter, a lesbian, a feminist, a visionary. Poems of elemental wildness and healing, nightmare and lucidity. And that is from not this postcard, but the back of the now classic and very collectible lesbian trading card of Audre Lorde. There it is from Risa, who will never let it out of her clutches. This beautiful postcard, I'll just share this story with you briefly because I think it's relevant. Just as Julie, you talked about, having that touchstone with Lorde, this postcard I have had on every single office door of mine ever since I was in graduate school, because my mentor, a lesbian women's studies professor at the University of Nebraska, when I where I went when I was not out, came right up to me like the first day I was walking down the hall and like, basically figured out what was going on with me. And she gave me this postcard of Audre Lorde. She also was, her name is Barbara D. Bernard. She also taught the first lesbian literature class ever at the University of Nebraska. And of course, the book that we read was Zami. And we read and we read Sister Outsider. So on this card says, when I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, it matters less and less whether I am afraid. And that, I think, really epitomizes certainly Audra, but in hearing your stories as well, that really epitomizes how you have moved into your warrior stance as a writer. And I think if there was any question, I can't think of a person who better to introduce us to Lord than a person who has done a very, very deep dive into the work. So I'm very grateful that you were the person to be able to share that extraordinary braiding of Audre Lorde's work with your own. Well, and I'll finally say, as you know, Audre Lorde had vital conversations in her lifetime with Adrienne Rich, whom was mentioned on the card. That conversation, like across their intersectionalities, was and remains critical. And I like now to think of you as kind of being in conversation with her from your generation to her generation. And I want to thank you again for sharing your intimate process of being in conversation with, learning from and with her, and keeping her and yourself alive. So thank you again. Well, for those of you that appreciate what Headmistress Press continues to do to bring writers like Julie Marie Ward to our virtual stage and to keep the life and work of Audre Lorde alive, why not purchase 1, 2, or all sets from the Lesbian Poet Trading Card Series, with the exception, as you know, of number 1, because it's not available. Pair a card set with the books by an author. They make fantastic, unique gifts for your favorite lesbian, or including yourself. And with National Poetry Month just around the corner, this is a grand time to support the press that supports you in bringing the voices of LBT writers into print. So head on over to Headmistress Press website and purchase galore. Well, now to our open mic readers for today on this first day of spring during Women's History Month. I'm going to introduce each as they read, and I feel like there's a little trickster energy in the room for me. It's just me in this room that I'm in, my virtual room. So I hope I have the order correct. I believe our first reader is Anne Myles. Reset, there we go. Anne Myles lives with her 5 cats and 1 dog in Waterloo, Iowa, though she's hoping to get out soon. She's a professor emerita of English at the University of Northern Iowa and is currently completing her final semester of an MFA program at the Vermont College of Fine Arts. Congratulations. Her work has appeared in Lavender Review, North American Review, Greenbrier Review, Minerva Rising, and other journals, and is out this month in Water Wheel Review and Split Rock Review. In 2020, her poem, The Calling, was nominated for Best of the Net. Would you please welcome Anne Myles?
Thank you. I upgraded my internet a few weeks ago, and now I have a lot of problems with it. Can you hear me? Because you're frozen for me now.
We can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, you sound terrific.
Okay. I'm going to read two poems that have, well, connected to Lavender Review. The first was one of the first poems. I only started writing poetry after decades in 2018. And the first was one of the first poems I wrote. Still means a lot to me. And I'm really grateful to Mary for having published it. It's called Double Suspension Adirondacks. The literal reference of double suspension is it's the way that greyhounds and certain other dogs run, but there are other doublings and suspensions in the poem. Double suspension. An old champion greyhound runs with his daughter in the ruins of Fort Crown Point. Two women watch them, hearts lifted above their chests in common wonder. Stun glitters on its steep embankments on Champlain. 25 years ago, I drove north on the New York Thruway, heart pounding, to tell another woman I loved women too. Light over everything that weekend, the world leaping with promise, Alex Dobkin blasting from the car as we headed for Lake Placid. I studied how she and her lover walked, dressed, laughed, beautiful otherness only hours from where I'd lived. They showed me John Brown's farmhouse, high and plain, birds twittering over the grass and graves of those willing to take resistance as far as it could go. Later, I'd be the lover in the old camp on the hillside running to the shore, where once I saw the lake monster's back roll through the water, where one day she would snap and scream and sever me, and I would drive south numb and blinded, then move to Iowa, rounded fields like a woman's hip, a different spaciousness. And now I am back, realizing how I have kept these trees, these mountains holding their breath under the mist, these starved farms and ramshackle houses, cabins and canoes, this smell of pine and wood and wool, these bark eaters. The younger greyhound sniffs into the ruined rooms of the wars that made the country my grandparents would come to. Now we are at war again, invisibly, inside this very phone I raised to take a picture of the dogs for posting, mine and hers, two introverted women who know each other.
And the voice has cut out. So you're back now.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, that one's in Lavender Review, I think 2018. You can find it if you missed it. The next poem is coming out in Lavender Review in December. I wrote it during the first month of the pandemic, and it's called Fever. I recall of it her bedroom piled with books under the slanted roof, flannel sheets fuzzed with dog hair, smelling of her hairy dogs and the comforter I pulled up shivering. Below, she was playing cards with her old friends, but I knew she held on to the thought of me like keys inside a pocket you can't stop touching. Their voices drifted up. The whole house hummed with secrecy that I was there, the cherished one. How many years I'd shaken with pure longing just to be beheld, to come inside, to stay. Sooner than I expected, the friends were gone. She drew me a hot bath and my fever broke, and the night was still and just the two of us, and I slept curled by her warm back and thighs. How many years, so I can barely now remember what fever feels like, waiting for what might come and what I can't imagine coming back again. Alone, I press my hand to my own forehead, call some faceless, vast beloved to behold me now, some tenderness without a name to rise and hold me precious in this house of flesh.
Thank you, Anne. Your screen is frozen again, so I think I'm going to do the unhostly thing of moving to our next reader. Okay, I think maybe you're back. So why don't you come back on?
Hello.
Yeah, we heard the whole poem, which fever, I think. Oh, amazing. So yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Is it, would you like to read a final poem?
No, that was it.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much. Congratulations
Mhm.
on the almost completion of your MFA. No small thing. And what a journey you've been on. I love that story. And I look forward to seeing those poems. And
Mhm.
Mary Miriam knows how to edit and choose poems. Wonderful. And we'll look for your work in the Lavender Review, of course. Thank you so much. Well, next we have Katherine Fallon. Katherine Fallon is the author of The Toothmaker's Daughter from Finishing Line Press 2018 and Headmistress Press in 2021. Finalist for the 2020 Charlotte Mew Chapbook Prize. She is lead poetry editor at Mayday and reads for Pank. Her poems have appeared in Anye, Colorado Review, Juked, Meridian, Foundry, and Best New Poems 2019, among others. She shares domestic space during the pandemic here with two cats and her favorite human who helps her zip her dresses. Would you please welcome Katherine Fallon?
Hey there. I say that, but then of course I never wear dresses anymore. So now it's all sweatpants. So pandemic times. All right. When I read last time for Headmistress, I didn't read anything about sexuality. So I thought today I would focus on that a little bit. These poems are from a manuscript that are in progress that's called I Know What I'm Doing. This one is called Jessica, and it's about the Mutter Museum, which is a museum of medical oddities in Philadelphia. So it's a lot of really bizarre, like human remains type stuff. So you're going to be hearing about that. We were on a date. Jessica, Mutter Museum. There was a rattling of the panes as we stared into jars thick with quivering liquid. Entire heads sliced like summer fruit, the stillborn carcass of someone's encephalic daughter, wire through flesh in a pageant of human symmetry, a wall of human skulls, all men, most dead by hanging, lots of petty theft, rarely murder, and if so, only out of love, or suicide by firearm on account of fear of that same noose, or, of course, out of love. Never a second to that first date when our fingers brushed beside the soap lady in her gaping horror. What were we but fleshed puppets, too much alike, both courting the grave with eyebrows 20s thin. Of course, there was no romance, but Jessica, you could touch me. I invited you to, so you did, and it proved to you you did not want to. This one is called Altering a Bra. Our bodies have much in common, pleasure and a similar peaching here, there, tattered strap above shoulders hollow, dark shadow lakes. Undone, she will spill like water beyond this. I bite the thread to break it, so close to her goose flesh. Dented thimble, prick of blood for haste. I do what other women have done before, and better. And then the goose flesh on that one, Julie, I wasn't expecting to hear that in your reading. So I was like, oh, no, copying. And this one, the last one I'll read is called Self-Steward. And it's based in, these poems are all supposed to be based in certain locations. I've kind of trimmed the titles for this because they don't necessarily make sense on their own that way. But this one is based on living on a farm in the middle of nowhere. So that part's important. Self-Steward, Sunrise Ranch, Loveland, Colorado, 2011. 1. Out there on the farm, it couldn't have mattered less. Not that I was the only human being among the beasts, but I was the only one of my kind, and still, it never mattered. 2. We were, every one of us, coupled or not, quite lonely, so we became a pack of coyotes way down the canyon, splintering bones, tailing dogs. We were cow chasers, egg candlers, friends about the fire. We moved a literal ton of feed with naked strength, peeled heirloom garlic until we bled beneath the nails, went to work far before the sun did. Minds gone soft with grass, with scotch, with the stylings of toots and the Maytags. We were bodies tending, 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 never bodies in the better, baser way. 3. Columbia, Winston-Salem, Philadelphia, Ithaca, New York, Denver, Philly again. By the time of the farm, it had been 12 years and 11 addresses since coming out to my parents. And be it boon or risk, it had always, at every stop along the way, mattered. For me, the non-issue became an issue. Sure, there was relief in it, an invited hush, but also deep loss. Normalized, all difference ceased. I was queer like I was liberal or Southern or blue-eyed, like I got hungry, got thirsty, needed air. Thank you.
Like I got hungry, thirsty, needed air. Wow. Beautiful. Thank you for those poems that keep reminding us, each of us, of our own journeys and those creation stories and what they look like when they're actually in front of us, like we've lived them. And then when we write them, and then when we share them, that that unfolding that comes from that, and that shared humanity that comes from that. Thank you so much. I love the open mic. I love the prismatic nature of the open mic, and a true testament to what Headmistress Press curates, and not only curates, but community builds every month. Well, our next reader is Heather Tompkins. Heather Tompkins is a librarian at the Appalachian College Association. She's co-authored work on information literacy assessment and emotional labor in digital humanities. That is vital, vital work. I just want to name that. Wow. She's an amateur birder, and some of her proudest accomplishments involve animals. She's been hugged by a manatee, kissed by a llama, and rubbed shoulders with a flying squirrel. Her pandemic survival kit has included lots of poetry, queer romance books, and parasocial relationships. She lives in the bluegrass region of Kentucky with her wife and their 2 cats. Would you please welcome Heather Tompkins?
Thank you. Thank you to Risa and Julie and Sandy and all of the other readers. I was really glad that Julie shared that Audre Lorde was a librarian, because I think about that not infrequently. I was also glad to hear swimming come up multiple times, because I was in my 30s the first time I took swim lessons, and also the first time I took a poetry class. So both things I love, but which took me a while to have any sort of formal training in. And I mentioned that because this first poem I'm going to read 2 poems. And the first poem came out of a class that I took at the Loft Literary Center in Minneapolis, where I lived for many years just outside of Minneapolis. So I took a class in formal form, which was fun and intimidating. So this one is a Villanelle, and it's called Villanelle for Jenny. If I were a bird, I would live in a letter, soft belly of that E, or gentle tail of this G, room enough for 2 and ever after. Maybe the classic frame of an A would be better, with upstairs and downstairs baths for you and for me. If I were a bird, I would live in a letter. Perhaps instead we will make a bed in a number. We could dine in an 8 or bunk in a 3, room enough for 2 and ever after. From this spot, we watch riders board together, headed to work, dining out, exiting the Indian deli. If I were a bird, I would live in a letter. With plenty of neon to warm us in winter, old suburbs have starter homes aplenty, room enough for 2 and ever after. Silver maples and burning bush shade in summer, tire swings and dog bowls. Can you see it, lovey? If we were birds, we would live in a letter, room enough for 2, 3, or more, and ever after. So this second poem is a cutaway poem from chapter 48 of Moby Dick. In the early days of the pandemic, and then also throughout the summer, I read Moby Dick for the first time with a group of people online on Twitter. And so as a part of that, for one of the chapters, I did a cutaway poem. So this is, as I said, from chapter 48. Meanwhile, the fictitious monster declared his tale, so vivid and lifelike, to snatch against all rule. Their eyes must have quick wonder and awe. The omnipotent sea rolled along in a boundless bowling green, suspended. The knife-like edge of the sharper waves into the watery glen and hollows, gain headlong down the other side. The cries of the ivory pequod outstretched sails like a wild hen after her screaming brood, into the fever heat of encountering the other world, and strong emotions the first time, into the charmed circle of this whale. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. There is nothing like a Villanelle. I just also like saying the word Villanelle. It's a beautiful, beautiful form and word, and I appreciate you bringing your poems here to us today. Be well. And we move on to our next reader in the open mic, Samantha Pious. Samantha Pious is a multilingual translator, poet, editor, and medievalist. Her translations from the poetry of Renee Vivian are available as A Crown of Violets through, of course, Headmistress Press. A few are also featured in queer LGBTQ writings from ancient times to yesterday, edited by Frank Wynne. Individual translations have also appeared in Adrian, Lavender Review, Queen Mob's Tea House, Tea House, and other literary journals. My apologies, Samantha, and welcome.
Hi, thank you, Sandy. I love Treehouse. I think I'm going to use it in future. And thank you, Julie, and the other readers for those wonderful readings. I'm going to read a few poems from A Crown of Violets. And if you think any of them are familiar, that's because René Vivien was translating or adapting Sappho and some other Greek poets. So I'm going to start with one that we all should know. Ode to a Beloved Woman. The lucky man whom you make mad, he seems the equal of the gods in that he hears your laughter streaming and your silence dream, whilst I, in tears, I shudder and I cannot speak to you. A subtle flame has passed right through my flesh, and my sweat flows just like the bitter dew of the ocean's crest. A roaring of the noise of storms at sea fills my ears, for I founder in distress, more pale than the wild grass, and then I see your face through death. That's based on I think, Sappho's fragment 23. And this is another one based on Sappho. Like an apple with its golden flesh that sways amid the verdant orchard and the rivers, at the treetop, swinging in a cadence as it shivers, like an apple that, as it pleases the breeze, goes swaying and laughing in trembling dusk, you blossom, mocking passers-by for their vain lusts. In you, the autumn's knowing ardor holds, the gold and amber lying at its root, and you withhold, O virgin unattainable, your body's fruit. Sorry. This is based on a fragment by another Greek poet called Knossos. So it's called Knossos to the Foreign Girl. Dark-eyed foreign girl, sailing to Mytilene, to gather flowers sprung from Sappho's lips. Listen, I speak to you, I'm out of breath. When you, as true as echo, return into our midst, then tell us of the city lazily reclining, a courtesan with veils of sea-spun silk, whose bed is soft and strewn with rose and fennel, with iris blue and crocus white as milk. Virgin, tell Sappho that a woman sings, the odes where Atthis' smile still remains, that she has sung the verses of the sovereign poet. Stranger, tell her that Knossos is my name. Tell her that, in calling for her unknown touch, I sobbed with love, my unbound hair aglow. Tell her I see her, like the birth of Aphrodite. Tell her that I'm waiting, that I love her. Go. And how am I on time? Okay. Page 121. This is based on a poem by Erinna, another Greek woman poet. The echo swims down blindly toward the dark, where the most lovely choirs eddy futilely, and where the dearest memory sinks and founders like a ship at sea. The weeping woman, drunk on drowsiness, exhausts her transports by the columns overhead. The morning cup is empty, silence reigns among the dead. The mere, whose smoke ascends from golden censers, no more delights the gardens where the aloes dwell. The voiceless virgins weave the pale and white violets of hell. The many-stringed harps are still beneath the flowers, rusty like a tarnished looking glass. The waves of Lethe reflect the women lovers of embraces past. Persephone weaves, in mournful warp and weft, the broken strands of hope and of goodbyes. She only wakes in dreams amid the shadows that hold the eyes. I've got one more if there's time. Okay. This is another Sappho one, and that's it. In the future gray is an uncertain dawn. Someone, I think, will remember us while autumn burns above the amber fields with eyes of rest. Just one among the beings on this earth, oh my desire, will remember us. A woman whose brow will bear the mystery of love and lust. She will love the rippling in the olive trees, the sea spray in its light and leaping arc, the flowers of the snow and of the sea, the winter and the dark. And, bidding shores and riversides farewell, beneath the sunlight's somber, solemn glare, she will know the sacred love of virgins, Athos, my care.
Thank you so much, Samantha. And, you know, where would we be without translators like you to be able to bring those voices of those other women poets that we would not be able to connect with across time otherwise. So thank you for your important work. And we'll see you again very soon, I'm sure. Beautiful. Well, our final reader today in our open mic is a dear friend of mine. We are in a group together. Risa is in this group also, from Poets on the Coast. So it's really my deepest pleasure to introduce one of my Poets on the Coast sisters to all of you today. Sylvia Pollack's work appears in Floating Bridge Review, Crab Creek Review, and Clover, among others. A two-time Pushcart nominee, she won the 2013 Masons Road Literary Award and was a 2019 Jack Straw Writer, a really tremendous advocacy group for poets in the Seattle area on how to present one's work. Really great organization. Sylvia's new full-length collection, Risking It, is published by Red Mountain Press just this year, 2021. And she lives in Seattle with her wife, Molly. Would you please welcome Sylvia?
Thank you, Sandy. Yes, and here's my new book and my only book, and dear to my heart. So I thought I would read to you, yes. I would read a sequence of love poems that are in Risking It. There's a lot of other stuff in that book too, but I thought I would start with Kiss. Trellised tomatoes splay across the south side of the house, get drunk on their own sweet juices, stew in them, grow so boisterously when it rains, after dry days skins split like open zippers, and we, in an act of compassion and forgiveness, pluck them off the vine, offer them to each other's lips. I think all of us who are here today love words, as well as women probably, but certainly words. And there's something about the mouthfeel of certain words in archaic language. So some of that shows up in this poem, which is called Mossy Limb. And it has an epigraph. When passing by places where birds were sold, Leonardo da Vinci would often take them out of their cages with his own hands and set them free in the air. I love how the words mossy limb feel in my mouth. dropped jaw of moss, then a slight smile as limb lifts from my lips, mirroring Mona Lisa as she recalled a Florentine woman fairer as she herself was dark. Each came to sit in Leonardo's studio for a husband-commissioned portrait, then stayed to dally or slipped away, met in some nearby bosky dell, made each other smile. This spring, Bewick's friends snatch moss from our magnolia's trunk and branches, build their bower on our back porch, match Leonardo in architectural skills, but reject his distaste for procreation. They breed zealously, then follow Leonardo's advice, release fledglings to a world of dells and limbs and lust. Making the bed. She makes it clear she doesn't need my help or want it. Easier to do the job herself. Tugging sheets onto this bed I bought more than 30 years ago. Good, sturdy Scandinavian design. A storage drawer beneath the side that's mine. We've changed the mattress from time to time. Rigid slabs of latex foam, but now I know I need something more forgiving, something to cradle stiffened joints, sciatic pain. Perhaps it's time for one of those adjustable memory beds, each side independently controlled. Solo choices in the night, moving silently beside, not toward each other. And I'll end with anniversary song. Anniversary song. Listen, love, what I wanted to say dissolved in this afternoon's plummeting rain. Lord knows we need rain, but the timing was off. No umbrella, words written in chalk on my hand. Listen, love, what I meant to say has already molded. Overripe cheese, fuzzy peach in the back of a crisper drawer. Listen, love, what I might have said is in the pants press I gave to Goodwill. And what I should have said was festooned with blossom gardens of fuchsia crepe paper petals. Listen, love, what I will say is, I'm heating the leftovers. Supper will be on the table at 6. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. And I can't imagine there's not a person in the room who would not join me in like just congratulating you on your new collection, your debut collection, risking it. Brava, brava. And thanks to all our readers in the open mic today. We heard from Ann Myles, Katherine Fallon, Heather Tompkins, Samantha Pius, and Sylvia, as well as our spotlight reader, Julie Marie Wade, reading poems from her new collection, Skirted, and sharing her intimate connection with the work of the ever-present and ever-necessary, the warrior, Audre Lorde. Well, if you've enjoyed the 90 plus minutes that you've spent here today with us this spring Saturday, I hope you'll join us next month on Saturday, April 17th at 12 noon Pacific, 1 Mountain, 2 Central, 3 Eastern, when we welcome the dynamic duo of Jessica Jacobs and Nicole Brown. Always check your time zones for the correct time to join us here at the Collectibles. And a final reminder that you can purchase the Collectibles trading cards as well as all the titles at Headmistress Press at the Headmistress Press website. Well, that's it for today's very, very moving spring edition of the Collectibles Lesbian Trading Card Reading Series. I'm Sandy Yanone, your host of the Collectibles. And I'm also the author of Boats for Women and host of Cultivating Voices Live Poetry Sundays live on Facebook and YouTube via Zoom. Please feel free to join us every Sunday at that same time, 12 noon Pacific, 3 Eastern. The Zoom window will stay open for a bit after I stop talking for any conversation and connection people might want to make. And again, thanks to all of you for joining us today for this just really remarkable, stunning edition of the Collectibles.